My thanks to the library for this opportunity for me, and my thanks to you for your interest in coming in this morning. And if anybody has any influence on the sun or clouds, maybe you could do something about those windows. Apparently not. So the fact that you're here means that we have some common interests, and among those will be history and stories. And that's exactly what historical novels are. Stories and characters that weave their stories and their way through actual historical events. So that's what we're going to talk about today. I've learned along the way that historical events are puzzles, and the bigger the historical event, the more pieces there are to the puzzle. And always there seems to be pieces missing from those puzzles. And the historians, the good historians, are those who dig and root out those missing pieces, as many as they can, which makes it a richer, more full story. And sometimes even changes the complexion of the event or the story. Now, I happen to be a Vietnam War veteran, and looking around, I think you all know that that was a very divisive time. And in fact, that's been eating on me since 1968. But now I have a book that has the potential to begin the conversation of what I see as the little known truth of the Vietnam era. So I introduce a piece of history that I think will interest you, may provide some surprises, and maybe even fascinate some of you. You saw the first slide here, and I don't know who wrote it, but it hits the point that we're talking about this morning. So let me read it for you quickly. Grunt. Term of affection used to denote that filthy, sweaty, dirt-encrusted, foot-sore, camouflage-painted, ripped-trousered, tired, sleepy, beautiful son of a bitch who has kept the wolf away from the door for over 200 years. And I would be very happy to answer your questions, deal with your questions at the end of the presentation here. I do have books available, $12 cash or check, and the library has a copy or two as well, and they can be sent to you from Amazon.com at a reduced rate, only $11.99. So Weeds of War is the title, and that is set in Vietnam, but not in our Vietnam War, set in the first Vietnam War that most of us know as the French-Indochina War. That was the first war. That began shortly after the Second World War ended in 1946. And that area is now known as three distinct countries, Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And it was a French colony going back nearly to the middle of the 19th century and went very, very well for the colonizer, for the French, as all colonies did. Very cheap labor, almost free resources, good program. Well, it lasts. Dien Bien Phu. The subtitle is Those Who Bled at Dien Bien Phu. And that is well known as the last great battle of the French-Indochina War, that first Vietnam War, until the Second World War began. And as you know, Germany swept through France in a matter of weeks, isolating their colony, leaving them vulnerable, without direction, without resource, And in no time at all, the Japanese forces, who were partners with Nazi Germany, moved into Vietnam, simply bayoneted a few people, lopped off a couple of heads, and the region was theirs. And that worked well for them until the war ended, the World War II ended. At that time, they were cut off. And while they were there, towards the end, they were able to neutralize very necessary and good, I'll call it a spy network in Indochina that I will refer to later on. Before they left, angry no doubt, they went on a killing spree and sought out every French person they could. There were a number of French people living in Vietnam at that time, and any French soldiers who had been disarmed when they went in went after them as well. And on their way out, they went out of their way to damage or destroy as much of the infrastructure of Vietnam as they could, including the dam system that was necessary for agriculture. And they grabbed every crumb and grain of rice they could find, leaving the people in dire straits, starving, in fact. So the war ended, and France, of course, wanted their colony back, but they were not in good shape from the war, and consequently said, we want it, but we can't get there right now. What can we do? The place is in chaos. Well, pretty much everything was in chaos around the world, and the world powers got together, and they decided the thing to do is to send some troops in to restore order, which they did by way of sending British troops from the south of Vietnam in and nationalist Chinese troops from the north of Vietnam to restore order, and neither one of them did. The British troops, there weren't enough of them to be successful, and the nationalist Chinese had no intention of restoring order. They were full on rape, pillage, and plunder. But then the French did get it together. They did come in. The British troops left, and it's another story of getting the Chinese troops out, but that finally did happen. And then the colony again, the region was theirs. It belonged to the French, except now they had some resistance in the form of a communist guerrilla force that became known as Viet Minh. And spoiler alert, after that war was done, they became known as the Viet Cong. So the resistance was something the French tried to tolerate. They tried to work with it. They tried to negotiate, in fact. But that wasn't going well, and at some point, the Viet Minh attacked Hanoi in force, and that kicked it off, the first Vietnam War. And once the French responded in kind, that alerted Russia, the Soviet Union at that time, to provide more support to the Viet Minh. After all, their objective was world domination, communist world domination. They already had half of Europe, eastern half of Europe, and they had their fingers in every country in Southeast Asia and in other places. So it escalated from there. So all those troops, all those countries that were involved had their own perspective, their own opinions, their own agenda even. And that included Russia, as I said, France, of course, the Viet Minh, the communist Viet Minh, the nationalist Vietnamese, the Americans, the U.S. was involved, and Great Britain. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Now, if you don't remember how Churchill sounded, that was perfect. Winston Churchill, what a character he was. He was involved in the First World War, and he had a high rank with the Navy Department, and he had a plan for assaulting Turkey, I believe it was, that went south. Did not work well at all, so he lost favor. He was out. But Second World War came along, and his party again came in favor, and he was named Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And he smoked too much. He drank too much. Nobody would deny that, even him. But he didn't seem to bother him at all. He had great energy. He had opinions, very willing to share, which irritated some people. And one of the people he irritated along the way happened to be the first female minister of Parliament, Lady Astor. And at one time, she famously told him, "Sir, if you were my husband, I would give you poison." And never short for words, Churchill responded, "Madam, if you were my wife, I would take it." So let's go back and meet G.I. Joe here in the Second Vietnam War, our war. This has something to do with everything. For us, this young man is in a place called Cat Lai, Vietnam, 1967. He just came out of his tent, all clean and fresh, and he gave his camera his new Minolta 35 millimeter single lens reflex that he never learned how to focus, and gave it to his buddy and said, "Hey, Rock, take my picture here. I have to send something home to Mom and Dad. Hey, but don't get the cigarette in my hand there, okay?" So, of course, the cigarette is there. Why, you ask? Because that's what Army buddies do. So this guy was in an infantry brigade for about 22 months, 18 months of that in Vietnam. And he worked from a small military intelligence detachment. And it's important that you understand what military intelligence is. The ultimate oxymoron, military intelligence. And here's an example. Through this gate pass the leaders of military intelligence. I hope you can see that. But that's simply a taste of the self-deprecation that is so common in the military, and I adore it. The enlisted, in my experience, especially the lower grades of enlisted personnel, are very creative. They come up with all kinds of things to balance the fever of what's going on, almost no matter what, whether it's a song, a ditty, a poem, or graphics. They have a way of finding the lighter side. Here's a ditty that's been around for a while. The Army and Marines sleep under the stars. The Navy navigates by the stars, but the Air Force selects their hotels by the stars, and they prefer the 5-star. So there are a lot of jokes about the Air Force. How many Air Force jet fighter pilots does it take to change a light bulb? Only one, and he just holds the bulb up, and the earth revolves around him. And I use the male pronoun through this because that was my experience. It was, in my world there, strictly male. So there are a number of these that I found online. Here's one. Army, Marines, they both see combat. Marines and Navy, they both get wet. Navy and Army, they have their football game every fall. But the Army, Marines, Navy, they all make fun of the Air Force. But we can pick on the Marines as well. And I should go back and say, it's easy to pick on the Air Force because if you're a grunt, especially in a combat zone, it's pretty easy. You don't have to look more than once at an Air Force base and say, wow, those people live pretty well. Their quarters are good. They eat well. They're treated decently. Wow. So that's part of the envy. And as far as the Marines, yeah, let's pick on them. Here's the entrance exam for the United States Marine Corps. Instructions are: using the crayon provided, join the 2 dots below until the big hand reaches the 6 to complete this task. Please do not eat the crayon. And that's a thing these days that Marines play with crayons, but you have to watch them because they're likely to eat them. So the truth is, we're kind of envious of them too. After all, they're the ones who like to fight, so we're rather proud of them. Army, us, we fight because we're ordered to. But in my home office, I have this poster that says, makes me smile every day: if you want to fight, join the Marines. Keeping in mind that I'm Army. But it doesn't hurt a bit that the model for the poster is a very attractive female Marine sergeant. Boys will be boys, even senior boys. And I don't know a thing about the Navy, but let's take a shot here too. So the chief, would be like a sergeant, I believe, says to the seaman, "The command needs a volunteer for special duty." Seaman says, "Well, what's in it for us?" And just like that, we have our volunteer. And that goes double for the Army. But wait, there's more. Coffee in the Navy is black. If you want cream and sugar, you should have joined the Air Force. But how does it work when things go bad? Who makes the big decisions? Well, of course, that's the upper echelon of the politicians, the generals and admirals. It is theirs to start and direct, and they pass their orders down the chain of command to the politicians, the officers, and all the non-commissioned officers, all the way down to the privates, who are the ones who carry the load in the field of battle. Privates who have the least authority and the most exposure in combat. Aren't they depended on to diminish the privates on the other side? While the privates on the other side are trying to diminish your privates? Of course. So do you think privates have their own perspective? Oh, you bet they do. And Weeds of War, my book, honors them all. The privates, the coolies, the confused and the damned, the grunts, whom I all consider the weeds. Now, plans are necessary. I have plans, you have plans, whether it's for today or whether it's for the year. The military has plans. Oh, does the military have plans? And they don't always work out. In fact, that's a problem that goes way back. I mean, the Middle Ages, for example. So then I says to Borg, you know, as long as we're under siege, one of us ought to moon these Saxon dogs. But it didn't work out real well for Borg. I just hope he had a good sense of humor. And here we are in Dien Bien Phu. This is an actual picture, and that is actually Dien Bien Phu. You can probably just make out in the sunlight the Nam Yum River winding its way through the middle of the valley, which is about 3 miles wide, about 11 miles long. And that is airborne troopers jumping out of a perfectly good American-made C-47 into Dien Bien Phu. In the lighter areas, I'll just call them lighter areas, but there are several of them around a central headquarters with an airstrip. But the lighter areas there were called strong points. They were fortified hilltops that the French made that were quite defensible. And on the one hand, it attracted the Viet Minh assaults, and on the other hand, could not be penetrated, they believed. Something about the combat veteran, combat trooper. Okay, I guarantee you he's going to be dirty, very tired, probably scared, possibly angry, possibly bitter, and certainly hardened. And yet, there he is, in the bush, even in a flak jacket with a steel pot on his head, as we called helmets, an M16 on his shoulder. There he is looking into the wonder of a baby's eyes, thinking, what the hell is this all about? But kids love soldiers. And I think that's because soldiers, American soldiers, love kids. It's the way we grow up. But, it's not just Americans. Here's a picture of a Korean Marine in our war, putting his life on the line, exposing himself to sweep 2 kids off the street in the middle of a firefight. So, okay, I've picked on the Air Force, Marines, Navy. Okay, what's left? Well, that would be the Army. If I'm going to pick on the Army, I'm going to pick on second lieutenants. Were any of you second lieutenants? That is good. So, second lieutenants, picture a second lieutenant just out of officer candidate school or just finishing his ROTC program. He's going to active duty. He will be a platoon leader in an infantry platoon. Oh boy. So he is possibly the youngest person in that platoon, certainly the most naive, and sometimes he doesn't know it. Quite often, and that spells trouble, of course, but quite often the company first sergeant or the platoon sergeant will take the second lieutenant, the platoon leader, by the hand, figuratively, and lead him around, show him the ropes, give him a chance to learn his job and do it well. But it can look like this. The lieutenant says, but I'm still in charge, right, Sarge? And the sergeant says, well, absolutely. Now try to keep up and don't touch anything. Pretty true. And this is some of the creative artwork, no doubt by an enlisted person, a private, a weed, whatever. We got to get out of this place if it's the last thing we ever do. You probably remember that song. I played it before we started here. It was hard to hear. But that's probably, without a doubt, in my mind, the most popular song in Vietnam while we had combat troops there. It came out in 1965, the same year that combat troops went into Vietnam, and it was very popular all the way through. Anybody who has a tour of duty in a combat zone, in my world at least, had a definitive period of time for that tour. 12 months for us when I was there, 13 months for Marines. And after you go along and you're doing okay, you're still upright and you're getting towards the end of it, you start thinking about home more. You start thinking about, I can't screw up now. I don't want to get killed now. That's kind of a tough deal. So one of the things virtually everybody did, and probably still do, is think of themselves as a short timer. Their time is short in country. And they say things like, I'm so short that I can't see over my boots. And that's kind of that's the idea of what's going on here. But then it goes from there. It can be anything, as creative as you are. I'm so short, I tripped over a dime. I'm so short, I have to step up on a dime to sit on a nickel. Or one of my favorites, I'm so short, I would have to jump up to kiss a snake's behind. And here's a map I think I mentioned earlier on. This is Indochina. And in fact, the map represents the Second Vietnam War, our war. In pink is North Vietnam. In the olive drab, the Army would call it, or pea green below, is South Vietnam, or the Republic of Vietnam, more technically. You can see China on the north border of Vietnam. Dien Bien Phu is right about there. And then, of course, we have Laos and Cambodia. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail, that might be interesting for you. Ho Chi Minh Trail ran all the way down Laos through Cambodia. And then the troops and materiel could fade into Vietnam wherever they could get through. The book cover, you recognize the helmet, no doubt. But do you know what this is sticking into or sticking out of the helmet? That would be a mortar shell, a type of artillery. And this one is a good one, if anything like that can be good, in that it's a dud. Did not explode, did not hurt or kill a bunch of people. It only killed the man wearing the helmet. And below we have artillery. That's actually a 105 millimeter howitzer, ubiquitous gun in World War II, also used extensively in the Korean War and in both Vietnam Wars. In fact, what I find interesting is that same gun was used by both sides in the first Vietnam War, and the book goes into that much more. Well, here's a picture of a mortar tube, and that's literally what it is, a tube. This is a big one. I'm not an artillery guy, but I believe that's a 120 millimeter mortar tube. That's about as big as they get. The others, 81 millimeter, 60 millimeter, 40 millimeter, they can be broken down and carried by individual soldiers into the bush on missions, used effectively there. And that is an actual picture from Dien Bien Phu, as a matter of fact. And so you can see there are a lot of similarities between the first and the second Vietnam War. But one thing the first Vietnam War did not have was these, the helicopter. Now, there were bigger ones, there were smaller ones, but this was the workhorse, the Huey. One thing, the French had at least one helicopter, however, and I just ran into this. This is one of those stories that pops up out of nowhere. Just very recently, I ran into this and just had to include it. So I would introduce you to Valerie Andre, and she was in the first Vietnam War in 1948 as a medical captain. She was also a qualified parachutist and fixed-wing pilot. And while she was there, she was frustrated that it took so long and was so difficult to get wounded troops out of the bush. So she went back to France, got qualified in rotary aircraft, came back with this helicopter, and spent 2 years, 1952 and 53, treating wounded back in Vietnam. She piloted in that time 129 helicopter missions into the jungle, rescuing 165 soldiers, and in fact also completed 2 parachute jumps to treat wounded soldiers who needed immediate surgery. That is a real woman. Otherwise, after a firefight, if you weren't overrun, you took care of the wounded best you could, got them out of the bush best you could. You knew going on a mission you needed ammunition, you needed medical supplies, you needed food, you needed water. And how do you balance that? What can you carry in? What are you going to need? How long are you going to be there? And that's another problem, a logistics problem that goes way back, probably even before the Middle Ages. Look at this. Look, some of us will have to sit up front with the lutefisk. Otherwise, this is going out in style, going out on a pole in a cargo net. And who these guys are doing the toting here, I do not know, but my best guess is that they are prisoners of war. And that was the style of the time. If you had a prisoner that you could trust, you put him to work. And they did. The French did extensively. And here's a paratrooper of that war, the first Vietnam War, just loaded up with what was needed and just trying to get on that airplane. And these are my heroes. French Foreign Legion. And my book is extensively, the stories are told by the French Foreign Legion and the Viet Minh, both sides. And only legionnaires are entitled to wear the kepi. That's the white hat, very distinctive. And they only are awarded that if they survive and graduate from the very rough boot camp of the Legion. They only made up about 25% of the French force in the First Vietnam War, but did a lion's share of the fighting. And here are some legionnaires on one of those C-47s waiting to jump out of that perfectly good airplane. And I don't know that they are legionnaires, but I would bet more than $1 on it because I can see what appears to be 2 bottles, and I bet it's not ketchup. And that's one thing, one of the perks that the Legion had. They ate well whenever possible. They ate very well, and they got a ration of liquor on a daily basis. They were made up of not Frenchmen, but people from around the world. At that time, it was in large part German soldiers, Nazi German soldiers. Survived the war, were probably from Eastern Germany or Eastern Europe, and had nothing to go back to, had no prospects, despised communism, and moved on to France, joined the French Foreign Legion. And these are legionnaires in Dien Bien Phu on one of the strong points digging in. And this is an aid station, should we call it. It's a dugout on one of the strong points at Dien Bien Phu. And they were wretched. The French had the plan that with their airstrip, they could get the wounded out, bring in reinforcements and supplies. That didn't always work out. And as soon as the suicide assaults began by the Viet Minh, the dugouts filled quickly, and they were a mess. Wooden, or not wooden, but dirt walls, dirt floors, rain every day, created mud, and it was a great environment for maggots. Now, if you went back through history and could pick out 2 individuals who were the least likely to put together a force that could outlast and arguably defeat 2 world powers back to back, boy, I know who I would pick. It would be these 2. Vo Windshield, who was became the commanding general of both the First Vietnam War against the French and the Second Vietnam War against us, and Ho Chi Minh, who of course introduced communism to Indochina and has quite a story. What a character he was. He had many, whatever resource you look at for him, they will tell you that he had many aliases. And I put the range there, 50 to 250. Take your pick. But he left Vietnam at a young age in his mid-teen years. And we don't know if that was because the French weren't happy with him. They weren't. Or because he had a sense of wanderlust. And I happen to think it was a combination of those. So at 15, he left Vietnam, ended up on a steamship, crossed the ocean, crossed several seas, and did some interesting things. He was trained at Moscow's International Communist School, for one thing. In 1920, for another, he was a founding member of the French Communist Party. He was humble, well-regarded, charismatic, very intelligent, spoke a handful of languages, and he was able to curry favor with not only the Russians, with Joe Stalin, but also with Mao Zedong, the communist leader in China, as well as Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist leader in China. And he worked for the Americans, an American team in Vietnam almost towards the end of the Second World War, going back to that spy network that was crashed by the Japanese. And the Allies desperately needed real-time weather reports from the mountains to get resupply from Burma to the Chinese battling the Japanese at that time. And he tried to curry favor, of course, with America. That was part of it. And he sent letters, more than one, to Harry Truman, who was president at the time. And that didn't work out for him, for Ho Chi Minh. And here's a picture I took a few years ago in Boston, because in 1912, Ho Chi Minh, under an assumed name, was a pastry chef there, which I found quite interesting. And General Vo Win Giap. Okay, I would love to confirm this, but for now, I will just read part of it. Let's see. The following quote is from his memoirs, currently found in the Vietnam Memorial in Hanoi. Quote, "What we still don't understand is why you Americans stopped the bombing of Hanoi. You had us on the ropes. If you had pressed us a little harder, just for another day or two, we were ready to surrender. It was the same at the Battle of Tet. You defeated us." And I was there. I can account for that. We knew it, and we thought you knew it, but we were elated to notice your media was helping us. They were causing more disruption in America than we could in the battlefields. And here's a quick picture of Viet Minh at the end of the First Vietnam War, in uniform, standing tall, well-armed, well-trained by the Chinese. And here's a picture I just like for no good reason. These are NVA troops, North Vietnamese Army, from the Second Vietnam War. And if you can tell, I think they have a lot of attitude there. Swag, whatever you want to call it. But they belong in Hollywood. And I would love to rename them. The middle one would be Rambo. The one on the left, I would say, is Charles Bronson. And the one on the right with the shades, okay, Maverick, Tom Cruise. But I can tell you, they have not been down the Ho Chi Minh Trail yet. That was not for sissies. More than occasionally, we had converts, Chu Hois, they were called, enemy soldiers who defected. And one of them had quite a story in being debriefed from our infantry. And that was that it took him 3 months to get all the way down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, nothing but mayhem and death and disease. If it wasn't bombs, it was Agent Orange. If it wasn't that, it was the topography, the hills, the mountains, the rocks, the mud, the weather, and if nothing else, it was mosquitoes. And that was probably the biggest deterrent or casualty causer that the North had, dengue fever and malaria, of course. But he finally made it. After 3 months, he made it to the bottom, and he found his outfit, reported to his commander, said, "Yes, sir, Charlie here. What are my orders?" And the commander looked at him and said, "Well, what did you bring, Charlie?" And Charlie said, "Well, yeah, okay, these 2 mortar shells." "Ah, good. I've been looking for those. Come with me, Charlie." So they go on a little walk and a little farther walk, and pretty soon they end up at a mortar pit where one of those tubes was set up. And the commander took one of them, dropped it down the top of the tube. It goes off. Takes the other one, drops that down the tube. It goes off. And Charlie's astounded. He doesn't quite know what's going on, didn't know what to expect. He said, "Well, what are my orders, sir?" And the commander looked at him and said, "Charlie, go back and get 2 more." True story. Okay, so here are some of the characters. In fact, these are the major characters from Weeds of War. And in red, I put the last names, and I do that because the Vietnamese names, the last comes first. So we have Master Sergeant Phillips, and he's actually an Englishman who served Great Britain in the Second World War throughout. He was even a survivor of Dunkirk and went through a lot. Got back to England after the war, but he couldn't cut it as a civilian. It was too much of an adjustment. He ended up back on the continent and joined the French Foreign Legion. Aidan Connor, young, naive Irish boy who got himself in big trouble and had to leave home quickly. He ends up in France, no prospects, doesn't speak the language well, and he was very grateful and happy to find out that he could apply to the French Foreign Legion, and there he is. Corporal Munt is the third Legionnaire, and he is a German survivor from the Second World War, and he has his own agenda. The other three are Viet Minh. Doc Pho Nguyen, shy village boy, humble, doesn't cause trouble for anybody, does what he's told, and learns after becoming a coolie that he has a character about him, a quality that makes a difference. Pham Van Hue, on the other hand, is a city boy from Haiphong. And even though Haiphong was controlled by the French, there were Viet Minh in and about, and a recruiter got a hold of him, told him that he would do well to be in with the Viet Minh, gave him a test. He did so well. He said, that's the way to go. We have now, the Russians gave us a Communist International Academy up in the northwest corner. You will go there, and if you graduate from that, you will come out an officer. You will make rank fast. Oh, that's the way to go. So that's what Pham Van Hue did. Lee Thuy, the third Viet Minh. She is a plucky female coolie. Nobody told her to be a coolie. She just wanted to do her bit. And she does that and more and becomes a Viet Minh soldier. And I picked out several excerpts, and I'm always short on time, so I'll read just the short one. And this is Sergeant Phillips dressing down the recruit, Aidan Connor. Listen, recruit, bones can be strong, muscles meet the standard, but inside is where it counts most, precisely where you are soft. The lieutenant can't see it, not like me. Your comrades here, they know it. You cloud the air with that pansy-ass comportment of yours. A handful of years ago, half these men were either marching on Berlin or parading goose steps for the Fuhrer. It was bad times in that war. If you weren't butchering, you were getting butchered. Most of these blokes lost everything there was to lose. Now here they are, doing what they're good at because of that fucking war. For them, it's a chance at a new start. I don't see you with the iron in your gut to survive the bush, even if you do meet the standard. You excel in just one thing, getting by. So that's the flavor. It gives you an idea of the writing style, perhaps. Something else that might help is some of the feedback that I have received. Let me hit some of that. I'm toward the end of your book, and I'm blown away by it. Kudos to you. Here's another one, an email. I was captivated by the entirety of the battles and all the characters in the novel, more than the love affair. Yes, there's a love affair. It was fun, getting interesting, but the history and zeitgeist of the time was what kept me fascinated. Or another one. Hi, Paul. We both read your novel, and we both agree. Very good read. The way you make the history and details of the conflict so fascinating kept us eagerly reading. Gruesome at times, but that's real war. So mind-boggling that we, the USA, continued the march into Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan. And I'll jump to the review on Amazon.com. This author knows the ground, displaying the lead up to and aftermath of the quagmire that was Dien Bien Phu in minute, sometimes excruciating detail, though not without a sensitive and compassionate look at the Viet Minh weeds of war. 3 privates, among others, who struggled, failed, and or succeeded. Not an easy read, but it affords an incisive insider's look at the machinations of war at this rugged, ragged, real place and time in history, worth the reader's work. And finally, this came from a woman I worked with for a few years before I retired. She is a nurse, and she is also a veteran of Desert Storm in 1991. I read your book and have been meaning to email you for months. I loved it. The girls, her 2 daughters, like 19 and 20 now, are excited to read it and are fighting about who gets to read it now. I loved the characters and how they all intertwined in the end. As I read, I thought, how are they going to come together here? How is Paul going to do this? I can't even really get into words how I enjoyed it. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas. Are you working on any new novels yet? The answer is yes, I am. I'm working on a sequel right now that takes off where Weeds of War ends. And we made it. That's it, folks. And I'm shocked. Thank you.
Thank you.
Happy to entertain any questions you might have or comments.
Are you willing to make any comments with regard to what's going on this weekend between Russia and Ukraine?
Absolutely not.
Not a word.
Well, you know, from where I'm from, and you as well, we don't trust Russia or Putin any farther than we could kick him if we had the opportunity, but we would try. So he's very capable. If intelligence says that he has a plan to attack, he has a plan to attack. I do believe in our intelligence. Yes, ma'am.
Our intelligence is capable of finding it out.
From different directions. Absolutely.
My question is that the father of my children was a Vietnam War veteran and Marine, and he did art in order to heal his wounds.
Yeah.
And he had a show a number of years ago at the Northfield Arts Guild called Of Shapes and Shadows. And so he worked through all of his experiences through his art. I'm just curious to know why did you choose to write about this particular thing for any reason like that it became an emotional healing to you, or you were just finding a good story?
No, it's therapeutic. And for years and years and years, it was there. How is it going to come out? How can I make it come out? And I tried different things, different ways, and I knew it would be through writing. But it wasn't until I started with it. Actually, this iteration began with the pandemic, when I had my butt in the chair and it stayed there because there wasn't anything else in life. And then I could follow one stream of thought and ended up taking myself somewhere that took me somewhere. And I did it kind of sideways, if you can see that, by not directly doing the Second Vietnam War. I did it through the First Vietnam War. And that was, that has such an impact on the Second Vietnam War, and I think people don't understand our war very well at all generally. And I think, just like your former husband, I believe it is, thought it was a bad deal and misunderstood. And it was the first war that we lost. We won the battles, but we were told we lost the war. What's wrong with us? And we didn't see it that way. Yes, Jamie.
I guess I'm not quite sure. Is a coolie a partisan, a peasant, or a peasant partisan, or what?
Yeah, a coolie is typically a peasant, almost probably always a peasant, but yeah, just someone who does the work.
Okay, but some of them were partisans, like they were helping.
Oh yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
And in the north, or if you're under the control of the Viet Minh, then you were a partisan.
Okay, and they had that in the south, and there were coolies. I mean, this is the second.
Right. And okay. Are you talking about which war?
Well, I guess I'm. Did they? That's part of the question. Were there so-called coolies, designated coolies in the second Vietnam War?
No, I would say no. Not that there weren't, but I would say no. Except, yeah, there were thousands, tens of thousands that down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Those were a lot of coolies bringing down the support, the supplies, the munitions.
Okay.
But we weren't allowed to go into Cambodia or Laos. So that was a sanctuary.
Oh, I see.
The Viet Cong could attack wherever they could attack in the south, but then they could fade back across the border and we're safe. Or back into the north. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Paul, can you offer a little history to us on the exit of the French and the entrance of the Americans, that transition?
Seamless. Yeah, there was a Geneva Convention called for 1954 for July, I think it was. Or actually it was to begin in May of 1954. So that's the world leaders were going to get together and solve this problem and the Korean problem as well. They hadn't decided yet how that was going to. The war had ended. The shooting, for the most part, had stopped in Korea, but it wasn't resolved yet. Is it going to remain North Korea, South Korea? And then we have to take care of this Vietnam issue. The French want out. They weren't totally defeated, but they were demoralized. It was too expensive, and they didn't have enough people. The officers of the French Foreign Legion, for example, were French. The officers of the colonial regiments were French. So almost all the officers were French, but that was it. The troops themselves were other things. And their officer candidate school turned out officers every year, but at the end, never enough to resupply what was being lost in Vietnam. In other words, they were losing more than they could put out. So the French wanted out. Dien Bien Phu was their last big hurrah, and they thought if they could entice the Viet Minh to assault them and defeat them, that would be good for them in the Geneva Convention that was coming up in '54, May of '54, ending in July of '54. And it didn't, and the Viet Minh were thinking the same thing. They had to make the big push to look good at Dien Bien Phu. So they were able to get howitzers, those 105 millimeter guns, over the mountains that the French thought they couldn't. They were able to bring in anti-aircraft artillery that the French didn't think they could. So there's a big, long story there. And the Americans were right on it. The big concern there was communism. That's how it began in the first place. America, FDR, had no wish to put France back in Indochina as a colony master. We don't like colonies. We were one. But the option was to allow the communism to take over, and that was not tolerable. As I said in the presentation, communists were trying to rule the world, and we're doing pretty darn good at getting there. So that was the push, and we had Americans in there while the French were there. So when the French left, it was virtually seamless. And we didn't, not that we had troops there, but we had MAAG, military Advisory Assistance Group. That's what it was. And so we had a lot of good ideas there and put in place as best we could. Anybody else?
I just want to make a comment that I thought Vo Wing Jap's comment about how the media really helped their purpose was prescient.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think that the media plays a huge role in how wars turn out.
And I think that's one of the aggravations, whatever word you want to put on that, for veterans, in that the demonstrators, the media, saw themselves, and still do, as helping, as shortening the war, as getting it stopped. And veterans, in large part, believe they extended the war. They kept it going, that the enemy was defeated, but wouldn't stop because they were prescient in thinking that we would give up, which we did.
So Paul, were you already thinking you would have a sequel when you decided to focus on the French War?
Yeah, one thing leads to another. I don't remember. I don't remember specifically, but I did want to get back to Vietnam in the Second War. And some of you have read the book, I know. And so I take off with a sequel where this one ends and goes someplace else. But then I can see a third book going, getting to the Second Vietnam War with some of the same characters or their offspring. Some connections there anyway.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you.